If that's known, why is it allowed?
Well, I think
How are companies allowed to put things in food and sell them to us that is proven do these kind of things to us, like which has all the knock-on effects on.
I mean, this may be a bit harsh,
service.
but I think that, going back to good intentions, over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a rising awareness amongst consumers around the ethicality or the lack of ethicality of a whole range of consumer products, and food has been at the centre of that. And this has allowed companies to exploit that marketing opportunity, and they've seduced us, and they've played on our naivety. So I would like to encourage all people to be less naive and just to be more critical and look at the back of. The easiest thing to do is just to look at the back of the packaging and look at the ingredients.
Sure.
And if you can't pronounce the names of those things on the back of the ingredients label, it's probably not going to be doing you any good. Regardless of how well the product claims that it's doing something good for you and the planet.
So they might be fixing one problem, but they introduce some other issue.
Yes, exactly. And usually they're ahead of
Yeah.
regulation, and so they can get away with it. And it's not necessarily, as you say, done on purpose each time. It is people trying to maximise profit and speak to their shareholders. So on the one hand, anyone listening to this, I would highly recommend that they read Ultra Processed People by Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, which was a New York Times bestseller, and it really lays out very clearly, for a sort of intelligent 12-year-old to understand, I think is the phrase that he uses. I'd also read Henry Dimbleby's Ravenous to get an idea as to what a series of solutions could look like to bring this entire food value chain into being more sustainable. And then I suppose the piece that we've touched on a few times here, which is something that I suppose Simon and I are keen to stress, is we're not just interested in trying to get every farmer to become regenerative. We know that's going to take time. What we're more interested in is showing people quite how much is already going on globally to push this space. So on the one hand, it's farmers. You then have the corporates in the middle, and those corporates have disproportionate power, whether it's the 4 big commodity traders or the 4 big meat packers in America, who've been zeroed in on quite a lot recently, or whether it's supermarkets. And Simon and I speak to many of these players, and some of them may spend longer justifying the scientific progress they've made in glyphosate, for instance, which we would obviously inherently disagree with. But the majority of them are genuinely trying to find ways to intelligently transition their supply chain at scale in a way that is going to be economic for them, but ultimately for the whole ecosystem. And that's exciting for us because, on the one hand, it does mean that Simon and I will invest in companies that work directly with big ag and food, who have been the culprits of this frankly pollutive system and dangerous system. But on the flip side, they're the ones that are able to act quickest and at scale. So whether that's producing a biological input that would replace a fungicide or a herbicide, or whether it's trying to get them to understand quite what the negative consequences of their current farming practices or supply chains are. Right. And the movement is, I suppose, one litmus test we have in terms of being able to look at the enormity of the movement is the amount of companies that are trying to get venture funding, which implies that they also want to be venture profile in terms of the returns that they want to make, is enormous. And there aren't enough companies, investors that are focused solely on this space at the moment, at the early stage. We invest globally, but within the UK as well. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is there's a lot of often very fair perceived wisdom around the difficulty of introducing new business to farmers, the idea you have a single growing cycle, the idea that lots of farms are laden in debt, the idea that they're multi-generational and have been acting in a certain way. But regardless of all of that, which is a system that will take a long time to change, there is, across this farm-to-fork value chain, a swathe of technology that's coming online to make things easier to transition, producing methods to do it, to show how to lend to farmers, for instance, in a way that is far more understanding of the amount of time that they might need to transition to a regenerative system than a normal agricultural lending bank might be geared up to do at the moment.
Right, because there's that valley of death, as they call it, where as they transition, there's a big capex going in, and maybe they reduce their income or their yield, but longer term it's up, but there's a short term dip, from what I understand.
Or there's the concern, there's a risk, there's a perception and perhaps a real risk that is what's going to happen.
Right.
I perhaps mildly disagree with you and say that, and we'll only know in time whether this is correct or not. I think that humans are highly innovative and adapt very, very quickly when they have their backs up against the wall. And I think the farming community is globally, it definitely has its backs against the wall. So,
And who's pushing them there?
so I will over-index on the pace at which regenerative farming practices get adopted globally, despite all of the doom and gloom, which is largely a sort of a city person's perception or an academic's perception of what's actually going on.